Hello everyone, Navi Ramran here from Tech and Learning. Thank you for attending today's Tech and Learning Future-Proofing Your District Plan Conference. A special thank you to our sponsors, Catch-On, Classcraft, FileWave, Global Teletherapy, GradeCam, Sanford Programs, and thank you to all of our association partners. Today's virtual conference is focused on taking the lessons learned from current remote learning programs to create long-term plans that support effective teaching and learning both online and in person. I want to take this time to remind everyone to log into the Conference Hub using the link sent in your confirmation email. Once you are logged in, you can visit a sponsor booth to learn about their offerings and book a meeting or live chat with them. You may also see your personalized agenda, network with over 1,000 of today's attendees via the registrant directory and chat features, access all of the conference resources and the download tabs, and you also have the opportunity to win prizes throughout the Conference Hub. You'll find several ways to enter yourself into our passport to prizes. Please visit all of the pages using the navigation bar at the top of the page. Each time you find a button and fill in the form, you will earn one entry into the raffle. All entries are eligible for a series of prize drawings, only one prize per participant. You can enter once for every button that you find. We will announce the winners via email at the end of the conference. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for presenters during the webinar, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature. Please know we capture all questions and our presenters are happy to answer them as time permits. Today's slides and additional resource materials are available and may be accessed within our download tabs in the Conference Hub. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. Be sure to use the conference hashtag #TLTechLive in any of your social posts. Please join me in thanking our terrific speakers who have kindly agreed to take some time with all of us today. I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and spending this time together. Please join me in welcoming our presenter, Susan Gentz. Susan, I'll let you take it from here.
Sounds good. Oops. That was not the button I wanted. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I wanted to start off in the chat, if you could tell me a little bit about how familiar you are with the CARES Act and funds, that will help me know kind of where to start, how deep in the weeds I should go, because I can go there really fast. So if you could kindly in the chat show me, or just say, okay, not much, kind of familiar. I'll just wait a few minutes. Kind of familiar, basic awareness. Okay, so you guys don't mind if I go into the weeds then, right? Is that where we want to go? I understand that policy can get a little eyes glazed over at times, so I am going to do my absolute best to make sure that this is interactive. I will keep the chat up as I'm going. I'm a medium multitasker when it comes to chat and presenting, so hopefully it's not too disruptive. But if you guys have questions specifically relevant to the funding stream we're talking about, what that looks like with implementation, anything like that, feel free to ask, and I will do my best to make sure that I'm answering those questions. If it gets too much, we'll just do them after I've said all of the funds and everything. But I really do want to make this something that's not like, I really need to learn about federal policy, but I'm not that excited. So I will do my best to keep it as light as I can. So basically, we all know that there's a ton going on in DC right now as we try to navigate this new waters. Funds are coming through Congress, waivers are being applied for, accepted, proposed, and then there's a whole bunch of guidance coming through on how to implement both these funds and these waivers. So what I really want to do is start with the CARES Act itself and those funding streams. This is probably what you've heard the most about, but it's interesting because states are now doing different implementations. So even if it comes down at the federal level, there's a lot of things that are still going to look different state to state. And I will do my best to answer any of those. I will tell you that some of those answers might be, I'm happy to look that up for you and get back to you after this session because states are so different. I will tell you I'm in Iowa, so if you have any Iowa questions, I can answer those. And I did want to give you a little bit of my background going into this too. I worked in the Senate when the Every Student Succeeds Act was going through. So I got to know that law really well. And then I was at Aide for a time as a policy manager, again, working on both state and federal policy. And then after that, went over to the Center for Digital Education, where I was the deputy executive director there. So my entire background, I worked in the Iowa House before I went to DC. So I have a lot of policy background and hopefully can help with some nuances and questions that are coming up as your district is thinking about how to best use these funds. So there's really 4 specific funding streams currently, which address education, K-12 specifically. And the first one is it's called the Stabilization Fund, and that's where that $13.5 billion for K through 12 districts came from. And this is also known as the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Act, or ESSER. So if anyone uses that acronym with you, that's that $13.5 billion, which is supposed to be the main source of funding for K-12 districts through the CARES Act. That has already been allocated to states, and in some states has already gone down to the districts. So you could look up on your state Department of Education site how much your state got, and hopefully your state, if they haven't already, will soon be distributing those funds directly to your district. So that's the current status of ESSER. Those funds should be available soon if they aren't already. There's also $3 billion for the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or the GEAR Fund. This was a $3 billion fund that was distributed among governors. So they all had their funds to hit the districts that have the, quote, hardest burden from coronavirus. So that's another fund that we have. And then just maybe about a month ago now, micro grants were introduced from the Secretary of Education at the federal level, $180 million. And these grants are a little bit controversial. They kind of act as vouchers. So there's definitely some political tensions that happen with those. But essentially what those do is they're competitive grants. The ESSER fund and the GEAR fund are formula, and those are both based on your Title I funding. So whatever that formula is for how many free and reduced lunch and all the variables that go into your Title I funding, it's based off that. So that there's no competition, right? Those are just funds that are automatically coming to your district if you don't have them already. And same with the governor's fund, although he or she gets to decide where those funds go with her own weight, or his. I apologize, I have a female governor. So these microgrants are different though. They are essentially, states have to compete for these. And so a really big evaluation portion of these micro grants are how hard the coronavirus has hit the state. And again, that's not really known what that means yet. There are evaluators that are starting to look over that. But these grants are interesting because once a state gets the grants, then they go to the districts, and the districts can actually give them to teachers and families as individuals. So if a teacher wants to do something specific to professional development on how to go to remote learning in coronavirus, that money could be used specifically by the teacher as almost a reimbursement. So these are very different from the formula funding of the other 2 issues of the GEAR fund and the ESSER fund. So they're interesting. They're still new. They're still being regulated. There's not a ton of guidance, but something that you could be aware of. And if you think your state qualifies as one of the hardest hit, be talking to your state department and saying, hey, are we going for these? It's definitely another source of funding that you could either give directly to families or teachers. And, you know, if you give to families, you can talk about, you can buy a hotspot with this, you can get connected. This could help with your internet. And it's really wide open on how the funds can be used. And that's actually the same for the stabilization fund and the governor's fund. When you think about ESSA and Title 4A, for example, you have to spend 20% on a well-rounded education. You have to spend 20% on safe and healthy schools, and there's a cap on how much you can spend on technology. These have no caps like that. They're whatever your highest need is to get your students connected and learning, that's how these funds are used. And then the last one that we just saw too is there's now $3 million for a student-centered funding pilot. So this is actually something that was authorized into existence through the Every Student Succeeds Act, but no funds were ever allocated to it. So now there's actually $3 million to do that. And if you're thinking about blended remote learning and how you can personalize it and really make it a student-centered model, this would be a good place to use those funds as you're thinking about perhaps what blended even might look like in the fall. So those are our 4 main funding sources at this time. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the application. Again, some of you might have already submitted yours, just depends on the state, but for those who haven't, this process was made to be incredibly streamlined. So where in Title IV again, for example, and I'm just going to use that title a lot because it's technology dollars, and that's a lot of what we're talking about when we're thinking about going to a remote environment. But the idea is that the assurances here are not a burden to getting those funds. So a lot of the ESSA application says states may require a district to do this, or states may require a district to tell us how they're going to do this, but there's nothing that requires districts to have a full set out plan of accountability for how those dollars work. So on the plus side, that again means we can get the funds quickly, we can act quickly, we can try to reduce some of those learning losses that have happened or will happen over the summer. But on the flip side, it really doesn't allow districts to think through what their holistic approach looks like if that's the route you take. Now, the funds are actually available until September of 2022. So that's longer than what your current funds you're allowed, right? So there can be this idea that, oh, we have to spend these funds right now. And that's absolutely not true. And in fact, as we go through, I'm going to offer perhaps a different strategy on how to use your funds to make sure that you're fully maximizing the funds that you do have, especially with the inevitable state budget shortfalls that we'll be seeing states think through their budgets next year. So again, the link is on here if you want to actually go check out that application if you haven't submitted it already, and happy to talk through that. And I have some chats, so I'm gonna take a minute from just talking at you. Are there specific resources you can purchase with ESSA? I believe that's in relation to Title IV Part A, where you can use your technology and things. That is actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with waivers, because currently, no. Every requirement under ESSA, if it's technology related, whatever it is, there's no limit on those. And I'll talk more about that with the waivers. And does the deadline impact all the categories under the CARES Act? For education, yes. There's other, like for small business loans, for the PPP, those other programs, those dates are different. But anything education is all that September of 2022 date. And I think those are the questions for now, so I will keep going. So here we're gonna go into some of those waivers that I mentioned. The funds are so important, of course, to help make sure that we can purchase the resources that we need. However, the waivers are just as important in this. So as you can see, this first one, it waives the carryover limitation for Title I. This is huge. This means that anything that you still have left after your July 1 date, you get to keep this year, where before you were only able to keep 15%. And this goes a little bit into that strategy that I was talking about, where you're only going to have the year to spend these versus till 2022 for the stimulus funds. So if I were a district, I would be looking at my carryover funds and what I can do with those, and then look at the stimulus funds. Now, if you need to use both of them at the same time to get the resources you need, that's fine. But I would strongly encourage you to look at that carryover budget and make sure that you've got that allocated before you would lose it. So that's a really big, important waiver, especially because of, again, we know that states have been so hard hit by this virus, and you can literally go state by state and see where the budget shortfalls are coming. We can go to Alaska and see where oil was way down, right? So their economy is going to take a big hit, their state budget. Hawaii tourism, like you can go through every state and find the industry. So we're all going to be dealing with cuts in the coming year and possibly years. So just really make sure that you look at what you have in carryover. And again, I strongly suggest using that first, or at the very least bundled with your stimulus funds. Then we have our next waiver to the General Education Provisions Act. Again, the availability for Title I and a lot of the other titles in ESSA as well. Just waivers to make sure that you get to keep that money. You don't have to give that back this year. And then we get into Title IV, which is what I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. In Title IV-A, if you get over $30,000 from the fund, you must conduct a needs assessment to spend those dollars. That's waived. No matter what you're getting from Title IV, you can spend it how you need to spend it. So that's another way that you can kind of holistically think about, we're going online, what do we need, how do we use them, without the government telling you you have to spend it on X, Y, and Z, or even do that needs assessment, which could prolong the process. And so Title IV, like I said before, it has 20% for a well-rounded education, 20% for safe and healthy schools, and a 15% cap on the technology. All of those are waived too. So you can, again, use that as just one big flexible block grant and use it however you want to do that. And then again, specific to the technology infrastructure, that 15% cap is gone. And this is another really interesting way to think about how to serve your educators well as you're thinking through your plan. The definition of professional development has been waived. So if you had some sort of lengthy process to get someone approved, if you couldn't use a vendor without doing like an RFP, whatever your process looked like, that's gone. And so if you need to get someone in your district ASAP to get your teams trained on name the technology platform, you now can do that without having to go through that process. You can just hire them on with these funds because of the waiver. Again, the carryover is so important. I just strongly encourage you to look at it in a way that you can really start thinking through, and not to plug my next session too much, but we're actually going to have a workshop style where I'm going to ask a whole bunch of questions for your district to think through this plan and what might actually work the best. So if you're interested in doing more of a workshop type, how you actually take something back to your district after this, that's what we'll be doing next in this room. So I'm sure there's a ton of questions. I wanted to leave plenty of time for those. Feel free to ask anything about the funds, ask anything about implementation. I will say in my state too, we're allowed to retroactively spend the CARES Act money from the stabilization fund back to mid-March. So if your district has already bought things to help get going from coronavirus, you can retroactively use those funds to cover those. And I'm sure many other states are doing that. And again, if you would like to know specifics for your state, I'm happy to give you send me your email and I'll get back to you on that answer. But I would love to know what other questions you have, either about planning. Carryover on Title IV. We have a question. It's carryover for Title I. I doubt many districts are going to have carryover from Title IV. A lot of districts got the minimum of $10,000 from that fund. So there's going to be a lot more carryover opportunity under Title I than there would be under Title IV. Would you share your slide deck? Absolutely, you can download that from the hub that you signed up for. And let's see. Do you need to apply for a waiver, and is there a deadline to do so? So for waiving end of year assessments, which we didn't really talk about, every state applied for that and received it. And your state needs to apply for the waiver. They're the ones who would communicate to the United States Department of Ed. There's no deadline. There's just at the beginning, there was, this is the earliest you can do it, because they had to get everything set up for that. But there's not a deadline to do it. But obviously, the sooner you do, the better you can plan. But if you're not sure if you have or not, also reach out to your contact at the State Department of Ed, and they can let you know all the waivers you've been approved for. And actually, most State Department of Ed websites have a COVID-19 page, and there's a link to all the state waivers that have been approved already. On the formula for allotting ESSER, is there per pupil allotment, or would it just be used at the LEA level, not the campus level? No, it's not a per pupil allotment, but it's the same trickle down that you would get for any of your formula funding. So the LEA can then distribute among the schools based on the plan that they come up with for that. And I can pose a question back to you guys as well, if that helps too. It's always good to hear what districts are doing. If you already have received your funds, or how you're planning to use some of these funds, that's always helpful to hear from other districts what their plan is. Or if it's something I've heard from several districts that I talk with, that right now it's just like we're getting past graduation, and so planning for these dollars and funds is just starting to come to top of mind, because it was survival for a couple months, and now we can actually start thinking about how to create effective blended and remote learning environments for our schools. And I will also say that oh yeah, someone wrote, it would be great to be able to understand what other districts are doing, a session on sharing some of these ideas. That's the next one in here. It's called Stimulus Advanced Tips, and we'll be going through what districts are thinking about some of those ideas. And I can also share some of what I've heard in there too. So feel free to stick around. But when the Every Student Succeeds Act passed, there's a lot of flexibility built into that law around accountability and assessments. And it was pretty scary, and not a ton of states took full advantage of what was offered under that new law. This is a time to really take advantage of that and have, assessments. It used to just be our end of the year summative assessment was the only federal accountability we had. We now can do performance-based assessments, adaptive, we can do interim, we can do formative, and you can roll them up into a summative. So there's a lot of opportunities to think about assessment during this time, where the flexibility is already there, but maybe the coronavirus is actually going to move us forward in taking advantage of some of those flexibilities as well. Does anyone have any USDE questions on the waivers or guidance besides carryover? Interested to know if anyone has also taken advantage of the waiver for the definition of professional development. If that's something that districts are prioritizing as all of your teachers and admin are thrust into a new environment. You guys are quiet. And I also should say too, I assume most people in here are public districts. If there's anyone who's not, there's a couple of different things we could go over if that would be helpful. But did assume most are public districts in here. Okay. Non-public, what else should you know? So how the CARES Act is set up is that the money does go directly to public districts. However, if your public district gets funds, you need to be talking with them to see what you could work out with them for the agreement. There's kind of some contention on the Hill and with USDE right now where some senators and House members are interpreting guidance differently. So what I would suggest doing is reaching out to superintendent of your local district and talking about where the funding is that you can go for. And actually I can read you some of the contention that's happening. I think I have the, actually, no, I don't have it on here. So what I can do is I can send you some links about the interpretations that are happening, and districts might be a little bit slower to give some of those. Yes, as always, varied interpretations, yes. As always, when there's, no one really knows, there's kind of a game of chicken happening. They're going to be more hesitant to do anything with the funding until they get a definitive answer. So I can find those links and make sure that they're in the conference hub as well. And it's interesting, but also if you're a private school and maybe you already applied for this, you have the PPP and the small businesses things that you can apply for as well that a public district couldn't. So there's a few different places for non-public schools to take advantage of some of these funds as well. And I also should mention too, many of you have probably heard the HEROES Act passed the House a week or two ago. And this is also interesting. So when we saw the CARES Act pass, there was immediate passage, right? Within a week or two, we had this $2.2 trillion bill, the largest in history, right? Well, as we get further and further away from kind of the sense of urgency, more and more of the specific priorities of policymakers are starting to get added into these bills. And the idea of a consensus seems further and further away. So HEROES Act is called phase 4 of the coronavirus. And at one point I had heard that it would likely pass in June. Then I heard end of June. And as we get further and further into all of this, it's a little bit less clear on what that would look like. But what we do know is connectivity is priority for the House, Senate, and White House, so that even if this whole big package doesn't pass as a phase 4, they can still slice and dice things up for what priorities are and get those out. So I'd be on the lookout for that. And I also have read a lot about the Senate, and they're really interested in how these first round of dollars are implemented and used. So if we plan well, if we use them for good, if we see how we're helping students stay engaged, not have the academic slide, if we see how the remote learning environments are actually helping, I think that they would be more inclined to also allocate more dollars. So it's really important to plan and use these well, not only for the dollars, of course, for the benefit of our students and making sure that they have access to the resources that they need. And that's, I didn't really talk about E-rate or any of the FCC programs. They have a program called Lifeline, which got modernized back in 2012 to include broadband. Basically, through the Lifeline program, low-income families can get internet access to their home for $9.95 a month. FCC just put out this big press release about how they're still supporting it and they're still providing these services to families. So not only is there CARES Act funding, waivers, guidance, but there's also agencies that are doing things either with regulatory options or even providing some different funding. There's been a lot of disappointment that E-rate hasn't received more funding on there, but it is still available. So if your district isn't going for E-rate, I highly recommend that you do that. The window might have just closed, but there could be things coming to boost that fund and maybe get some waivers for that deadline as well. So it seems daunting and hard, and there's so many places to look, but all of these are super important resources for you to use as your district's probably looking at where to cut the budget going forward, but then finding some federal resources to help supplement that you may or may not have been going for pre-coronavirus. All right. Well, I will give a couple minutes to see if any other questions pop up. Otherwise, let you get up and stretch and move if there's not any other questions on it. And again, if you're just sitting down to think about what your plan looks like, would love to help you think through some of those things and find some resources. Your state Department of Education should provide plenty of resources and information on how to go for them if they're competitive, if there's, if you're a rural school, there's Title V money that you can do from it's called the REAP program for technology. There's just a whole bunch of ways that you can bundle. And I think that's the wisest way to go, because the bigger you can make your pot, the better deals you can make as you're buying too. All right. Well, if there's no more further questions, we can be done a couple minutes early here, and I will hand it back over to Navi. And here's my contact information on the screen. Please email if you have questions. I know that it's policy and it's a lot, but it's super important, and it's where we can have really helpful resources during this time especially. So that I will hand it back over.
All right, thanks so much. All right, so on behalf of the entire team, thank you for attending today's Tech and Learning Future Proofing Your District Plan Conference. A special thank you to our sponsors, Catch On, Classcraft, FileWave, Global Teletherapy, GradeCam, Sanford Programs, and thank you to all of our association partners. Please join me in thanking our terrific speakers today. I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us at this time. We look forward to getting together with you all again in person soon. Until then, stay safe. We'll see you back at 11 a.m. Eastern for Susan Sessions Stimulus Advanced Tips.